Okay, so my presentation is Psychological Toxicity of Working in the Gambling Environment, specifically related to how that compares to living with somebody who has an addictive disorder. So focusing more on that aspect, because the idea being that they are working with people who have a gambling disorder. Just quickly, my personal background, funny enough, 23 years ago in June, in fact, I came to Rotterdam. It's the last time I was in Holland with my two youngest and 7 months pregnant. So quite a synchronicity going on as far as that's concerned. I am Dutch born, and this is just a picture of the little ones climbing, and that's how they grew up. Plus the youngest that I was 7 months pregnant with is now turning 23 in August. And I come from a family of addiction, so that's why I say addiction is intergenerational. My beautiful children also have their tendencies, whether it's a substance or a gaming addiction. And I'm happy to say that my recovery as a result of being, the children or the child of two addicts has, I believe, made a difference in their lives as well. And I continue to work on that. These were my beautiful parents who were married on the 31st of May. My mum was pregnant with me at the time by 2 months, 3 months. I was due in December. And what a beautiful couple they were. Both have passed on since then. My father died at the age of 59, alcohol use, and my mother also suffered with that. So, yes, I have had to walk the yellow brick road of family recovery in terms of trying to ameliorate from the effects of having come from such a family. And it's a long road indeed. It will probably take me the rest of my life, but it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I'm grateful for that. And the reason I'm doing this is because Professor Richard Villeman, in fact, speaks about how Affinet is about helping those who have lived with people with addiction problems. And very often, as he says, numbers of affected family members, some of the policymakers and researchers are affected by family members as well, but that's not the heading over the door that they're coming in under. So I thought I'd be open about it, because we talk about it stigmatizing us, and that's why we stop ourselves from getting the help we need. And the heading that over the door that I'm coming in under is that of addiction counselor and addiction trainer. And addiction brought me, ironically, to the steps of the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation, where I started training for them in 2009. And I provided that training across the board in South Africa, sometimes outside the country, for all licensed gambling establishments. We also provided free treatment as well as a helpline. And I spent a very happy 9 years there. But it became very quickly apparent to me that there was a white elephant in the room, and that was that the employees were really struggling to cope. The employees needed help too in trying to make sense of their work environment and in coping with the way gamblers dealt with them or tried to cope with their losses, usually by taking it out on gambling employees. And I started hearing a lot of complaints. I saw a lot of signs of this distress amongst employees. And I started raising this issue at my office and asking for something in addition that we could provide. And this is finally what happened. They provided an employee support service, which was done by the lady, in fact, who ran our gambling helpline initially. And I will come to her shortly. So thankfully, the white elephant in the room was recognized, and we went on to do something about it. But because of all of that, I started making this comparison down the line between people working in the gambling industry and having very close connection with gamblers, and comparing that to people living with someone who has an addictive disorder. And so I've asked myself the question, Does the presence of disordered gamblers make working in the gambling industry different to other kind of hospitality positions, or, you know, other parts of that industry? Is it worse, basically? And does it affect the employee to such an extent that it can be compared to living with somebody with an addiction? And I will use the following to explore this question: some research, some related research, my own experiences and recollections, and I conducted 2 interviews with experts. And so how does, in fact, addiction affect a family member, whether it's a child, your partner, your parent, a sibling? And it is universally recognized that these are some of the impacts that addiction or living with addiction can have on a family member: trauma, anxiety, abuse, being manipulated, becoming manipulative, depression, even suicidal tendency, codependency, negative health effects, negative financial effect, possibly denial or minimization, and your own substance abuse problems or other addictions, process addictions, exhaustion, poor sleeping, anger, irritability, and last but not least, irrational behavior and thoughts. So are these effects found amongst employees in the gambling industry? And we found actually the short answer of that is yes, mostly. And we will go into that a little bit deeper. And I will introduce you to some of the research that I used to back up some of the things that I've had to say. Hing and Breen, they provided 2 studies: one, gambling among gaming venue employees, a counselor's perspectives on risk and protective factors, and then another one with Cairncross, employee stress and stresses in gambling and hospitality workplaces. And then Hugh, Luck, and Leong, the correlations of work conditions with unhealthy lifestyles and occupational health problems of casino croupiers. And then a South African study by R. Nodia, the effect of casino employees' demographic variables on quality of work-life domains. And I will be referring to all of them at some point. Funny enough, each one of these studies refers to how studies on this cohort are notoriously scarce, although I have found those studies to be revealing enough on their own. And not many reasons are profit for this lack of research on this cohort, which might not portend well for prospective researchers. But Nodia said the casino industry is very protective of its employee and customer information and data. I don't know if that's really true, because you could always anonymize your data. It's my belief, in fact, and others, that the gambling industry pays lip service to the concept of responsible gambling, their primary motivation being profit, and therefore gambling, the working environment is not great. In fact, it's a bit of a labor issue, and certainly the gambling industry doesn't really want anybody snooping around too much in that regard. Hing and Breen also refer to this dearth of research. They say gaming venue staff has attracted minimal research. I don't know why. Only 3 related studies previously have been published, all based in North American casino employees. And of course, Hing and Breen did research mostly in, or did only research in Australia. So we will use that research to compare or correlate these impacts to whether these gambling employees also suffer these impacts as a result of the gamblers that they serve. And we will also look at the 2 interviews that I've mentioned. So despite, my absolute certainty from all my recollections, I wanted to really check in with 2 people whom I felt could really provide honest and reliable information. The one is an experienced casino manager. He's been in the business, the gambling business, for close on 30 years. And equally so, our experienced counselor who ran our counseling line. She, in fact, founded Childline, and she went on to provide this employee support service throughout South Africa. And also a woman of great experience and knowledge, Barbara Boyens. She was happy to have her identity known, and our casino manager preferred to stay anonymous. And I asked them both a series of questions. Some of them were in agreement, some of them only partly so, and some of them not. And I think they are revealing in of itself. The first question I asked, is the environment unhealthy and abusive? Yes, of course it is. The red is our casino manager, the green is Barbara. He said, yes, of course it is, or at least elements of it due to the gamblers. And Barbara said, absolutely. On a daily basis, from clients and senior personnel, employees are taking abuse. How would you score this environment if you were a new employee on a scale of 1 to 10? Our casino owners or managers said it's a 6. And that's because gambling customers get frustrated and desperate and take that out and vent all that emotion on the employees, as well as claiming that, you know, the system is rigged against them. And he also, in that same breath, said it is important to choose the right people to work in this environment, and that they had a very specific recruitment process to be able to do that. Barbara said it's a 9 out of 10, so very abusive and unhealthy. Staff are not well trained and they're not protected by their seniors. And even cleaning staff take the brunt of abuse from gamblers at some that has happened. So it's across the whole casino staff. And I've heard that myself, beverage and catering staff, for example, are also the brunt of frustration and anger. And very little apparently is done to protect such staff. And I asked whether such work increases or encourages substance use, risky sexual behavior, and gambling. And the casino manager quite diplomatically said, yes, some employees did confide in him over the years. They had some drug-taking habits. He didn't feel it was more than average. Gambling did occur, yes. One employee took his retrenchment package and became a full-time gambler. Socially, employees did get together and gamble socially after work, more than average, probably more than average. And yes, there were a few unwanted pregnancies. Barbara says they have many parties after shifts where all this takes place, and they go on gambling sprees to other casinos together and engage in risky sex. They're not allowed to gamble at the same place that they work at, but very often they'll find somewhere else to go. Why do they gamble? Well, Barbara thinks because they're exposed to big talk of gamblers all the time and eventually begin to believe in the hype as well. And they used addictive behaviors to cope with the stress of the work. So it's a bit of a double whammy. I didn't really get a reason from our casino. I asked him about something that would have affected him greatly as a manager, and he said it becomes more of a responsibility towards staff and clients. And certainly in one instance, he had a really bad or unpleasant situation where the Muslim lady really became very, very upset and distressed at the loss that she'd incurred and called her imam, as well as eventually her brother who came to fetch her. And he really tried everything to calm her down and to help her. And he left after he had really spent overtime on his shift. And when he came back, she was there again. He actually banned her, but he felt completely defeated. And at that point, he also realized that you cannot get emotionally involved. So that was important in that regard. The management's attitude towards responsible gambling policies is very important. Although the casino manager did say you are expected to increase revenue and turnover primarily, and big players provide that. And self-excluding a big player will affect your revenue and turnover. And he made a statement that all top-level gamblers are addicted, which is quite an admission. So while management is responsible for the well-being or needs of a player, which could include recommending self-exclusion or NRGP treatment, revenue is always a consideration. And that is why self-exclusion is never more than 3 to 6 months. Barbara didn't beat about the bush. She says management's main objective is to meet targets and to make money. And although they pay lip service to responsible gambling, their heart is not in it. And of course, self-exclusion is something that can be provided by regulators or gambling boards as well. And even here, the staff were under duress in trying to cope with clients who demanded self-exclusions be lifted, sometimes the very next day or a week later. And they also, I gave them motivational interviewing training in trying to deal with clients more effectively. And so their exclusions were usually from 6 even up to life, or up to 5 years long. And so let's face it, gambling employees who know that gamblers are not going to be excluded for very long really know that that environment means that it is more dysfunctional. What kind of abuse is the most pervasive? Swearing mostly, verbal abuse, including personal attacks, gamblers drinking, using, losing, and projecting onto the casino employee, according to Barbara. And the casino manager didn't say anything else really disturbed him. He just said, you have to do what you have to do, and you have to learn to step away, and that training is essential, part of that being motivational interviewing. And for Barbara, she said, well, she didn't work there, but she did hear some very shocking goings on. What would you improve, or what would improve the gambling working environment? He said nothing really. He felt that training was sufficient and comprehensive enough, and that also there was a code of conduct which did not tolerate bad behavior. Barbara felt more training, more supervision, and more support was required. Strategies that would help: attitude, don't take things personally, be detached, provide and ensure support to your employees if you are a manager, be approachable, and allow employees to feel comfortable with you. Again, Barbara said training, supervision, and support. Do you think women are the brunt of more abuse? Well, Barbara said definitely. In fact, they're expected to ignore bad behavior and mustn't complain, whereas our casino manager felt that this kind of behavior was not tolerated, any kind of sexual harassment like touching or slapping on the bum. And he said, fortunately, everything does get filmed, audio and visually, and that sometimes he felt employees exaggerated things a little bit. Again, Barbara painted a very different picture, and she said part of what she did was, in fact, help employees set boundaries, give them tools to handle such difficult situations, and even if necessary, find ways of removing themselves physically. Do you think any kind of codependency exists between clients with a gambling disorder and employees who observe and see them? And so the casino manager said, certainly not. We do not encourage them. We understand the nature of addiction, which helps, and you need to know the signs of addiction. So he said no. Barbara said sometimes, but often they hate the client who abuses them and gets away with it. So yes, there can be a lot of resentment as well. Closing comment from the manager. He said there are always exceptions, but again, staff training is very important. And he felt that something like shift work and working on public holidays actually was felt to be more of a hindrance and an unpleasantness for employees rather than the gamblers themselves. It has to be said with regard to shift work, which is brought up quite a lot in the studies as well, that a lot of gambling establishments like sports outlets and horse racing places are not open 24 hours a day. And yet also there you see the same kind of thing happening with gambling employees. So you can't just blame it on shift work being part of the problem. So the conclusion that I reached with these two experts, these two interviews, and the sometimes differing answers is that maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It appears that tolerance of abusive behavior varies according to possibly your training and your position and experience. And certainly staff are negatively affected in the way gamblers behave, in that they act out and they do use substances and gambling and risky behavior as an offshoot, as a way of coping. And dysfunctional levels of gambling appear to be tolerated purely for profit motives. So there is no doubt that that carries on then, and therefore this unacceptable behavior is directly affecting staff. So these kind of things can certainly affect our employees on a physical and psychological basis. Yes, and so the studies speak of these things as well. They speak of emotional labor, ethical concerns, and supercharged environments as key stressors. And again, they highlight stress, emotional labor, exhaustion, and moodiness as some of the effects on employees in working in a gambling industry. And because I have so little time left, in fact, I've already run out of time, the things that employees, in fact, have to suffer is a lot of aggression, mostly verbal, but also sometimes physical, from gamblers because they lose money, because they get frustrated, and because they suffer withdrawal symptoms, just as much as anybody would who has a substance use disorder. Some of the behavior that employees are subjected to, as I said before, swearing, and all of these others that you see in front of you. And some of the effects of verbal abuse can be quite far-reaching. And so this is the kind of vulnerability that employees are exposed to. Emotional labor is something that I found to really encapsulate what employees are going through. And it's been spoken about in studies as well, where there's a lot of stress. You're expected to be polite and friendly, and in return, gamblers are very aggressive and don't reciprocate. And then also one says working with some highly demanding people in difficult situations, often with alcohol involved, and with people who have lost their rent money, their entire salary, and they have got not a cent left. And the effects of emotional labor have been discussed in studies as well. They include irritability, moodiness, and exhaustion, sense of powerlessness, and disillusionment. Things like moodiness, anxiety, and depression are also the effects of working in this kind of environment. Certainly the fact that there's substance use and increase in those kind of activities bespeaks or appears to be evidence of increased anxiety as well. The environment they work in is quite anxiety-provoking. It's noisy, it's smoky, it's artificial. Whether or not there's increased levels of depression warrants further investigation. Suicidal ideation, we did not really, I didn't hear of, and neither did I see that in the studies. And indirectly, just to say that we have had gambling employees, in fact, witness gamblers committing suicide, which can only be traumatic. And yes, the relationship between gambling employees and gamblers can become unprofessional and blurred and a little bit more intimate than they should be because of the time that they spend together. And because there's a lot of emotion involved. When they win, they tip graciously and generously. When they lose, you're in the dog box and you get, their emotion vented out on you. And so this is a roller coaster ride of emotion for an employee. A lot of recriminations are leveled at them. And I've heard staff members tell me of being reduced to tears and of being walking around for 2 days hurt and upset by the way that a gambler has spoken and treated them. And so, you can't become friendly, and yet they do become friendly with these gamblers. One moment they tip them, the next moment, can you believe it, they ask for the tip back. So like living with a person with an addictive disorder, you're expected to forgive and forget and to get on and to move on with it, because tomorrow they're back and they're gambling again. So that is a factor that really plays into it. Trauma, because you watch somebody breaking down in front of you, deteriorating visibly and emotionally as they sit there for days on end in front of a slot machine. And so, especially in the beginning, employees can become quite disillusioned, shocked, and eventually they become cynical and with a lot of underlying resentment as well. Certainly there is substance use without a doubt amongst our gambling employees. I've been told about this. One of our gambling board employees said he left the casino industry because he had to get away from that party culture. Barbara speaks of it, and studies also refer to this. Not just substance use, but increased and excessive gambling is a feature of gambling employees. And in fact, several studies speak of this. And my gambling employees, several of them spoke of gambling themselves as well. So yes, why do they gamble? There are a host of risk factors involved. Some of those that are listed here. The relevant ones here are stress about gamblers, the fact that they're in a moral dilemma about encouraging somebody to lose their money, the emotional labor involved, the resentment and the stress of that, and the drinking culture, which can lead to a cross addiction with gambling. The more they drink, the more they gamble, the more they gamble, the more they drink. Other risk factors are also listed here, which I think are pertinent, but not relevant to our topic. Impact on financial well-being wasn't really established, except for the fact that if you are going to use substances and become involved with gambling, then no doubt there will be a financial impact. And the NODEA study speaks to this, especially about drinking amongst gambling employees, that this impacts their economic and family domain. The moral dilemma is, again, all about, and it's slightly different to the emotional labor, but the dilemma of seeing somebody, especially an elderly lady, and we had many of those in our certain provinces in the rural areas who come and play out their grants and pension funds. So if that's somebody that's close to your heart, that demographic, or a mother who's just given birth to a child and is sitting in front of a slot machine instead of being at home taking care of her baby, those kind of things raise a lot of poignancy and possibly moral dilemma and ethical questions in gambling employees. So there is a moral dilemma. Protective factors against these kind of conditions is certainly, again, training, although some say maybe that can be overestimated. And many times employees told me that the training is required by the gamblers and not by them. The 3 C's would be a good thing for them to know about. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it, as we learn in Al-Anon and also as family of people with addiction. And certainly, is there a correlation? I think so. Out of 13 elements that we looked at, 7 correlated. 3 there appears to be some evidence for, and 3 not so much, need some more investigation. And those that need more investigation would be financial, irrational behavior and thoughts, denial and minimization. Some evidence for negative health impacts, depression, codependency, but certainly more positive correlations in terms of trauma, anxiety, abuse, manipulation, anger and irritability, substance use, and other addictions like gambling, exhaustion, and poor sleeping patterns. So in conclusion, there appears to be some correlation, and this highlights the toxicity of the working environment and indicates a need for ameliorating strategies. They could include the 5-step method, because that is what's used for the family of people with an addiction, living with somebody with an addiction disorder. Further research on this core cohort could be advised, and consistent support from management, effective training, and commitment to responsible gambling policies. Lastly, I would like to thank Affinet for their support. Thank you for the bursary, and thank you for all your help, Professor Richard Velleman. Without you, I would never have made it, and these are just my details. Thank you so much.